My wife and her parents humiliated me with a prenup when I was poor. Years later, they begged me to dissolve it after I made millions. But I discovered she was cheating, and that paper destroyed them all. I'm 38 years old. I run a pretty successful property management company in Denver. And I need to tell this story because it's basically the reason I'm never going to blindly trust anyone again, especially in-laws. What happened a couple years ago literally destroyed a marriage of almost 15 years. But the truth is, looking back, I should have seen it coming from the beginning. You know, all the signs were there, but I was too naive or too in love to pay attention to them. I met Kimberly when I was like 23 at a barbecue at a mutual friend's house back in 2010, and honestly, it was one of those things where you see her and think, okay, this girl is completely out of my league. She was an elementary school teacher, super cute, with that good girl from a nice family vibe that I definitely didn't have because I came from a normal middle-class family. My dad was a plumber and my mom worked in an office, nothing fancy. I was working in it at the time, making like 40 grand a year, living in an apartment with 2 roommates, basically surviving but not complaining much. We started dating, and things were good at first. I mean, she was great. We laughed a lot. We had things in common. All that stuff that makes you think you found the right person. The problem, and this is where I should have paid more attention, started when I met her parents. Frank and Carol lived in Boulder in one of those huge houses with mountain views. You know, the type of place where you feel uncomfortable even sitting on the couch because it probably costs more than your car. Frank owned several auto dealerships, like the classic successful businessman who makes you feel small without even trying. And Carol ran a boutique in downtown Boulder that was basically her hobby because she didn't need the money. From day one, they treated me like I was, I don't know, the landscaping service guy who accidentally walked into the house. They weren't openly rude, but there was this condescending tone in everything. They said, like when Frank would ask me about my work and then make that little, sound like saying, what a shame. You know what I mean? But I was in love with Kimberly, genuinely in love, and I thought eventually her parents would chill out and accept me. When we'd been together for like 2 years and started talking about marriage, that's when things got really uncomfortable. One evening, Kimberly and I were having dinner at her apartment. She lived in a much nicer place than mine, obviously, because her parents paid half her rent. And out of nowhere, she says, "We need to talk about something important." And I thought it was going to be about the wedding date or something like that. But no. Turns out her parents wanted me to sign a prenuptial agreement before we got married. And when I say she brought it up in the most awkward way possible, it's because she literally said, "My parents say it's best to protect the family assets," as if I were some gold digger trying to steal their money, when in reality she made almost the same as me as a teacher. I sat there processing what I'd just heard, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, because basically they were telling me they didn't trust me, that they saw me as a threat or as someone who wasn't on their level. I asked Kimberly what she thought about it, and she said she understood, that it was just a normal precaution in families with money, that it wasn't anything personal. But it felt personal. Very personal. So after like a week of thinking about it and discussing it with her several times, I agreed to sign the agreement because I loved her and because honestly I thought if the marriage worked out, that paper would never matter. The prenup basically said that anything each person brought into the marriage or earned during the marriage stayed with that person in case of divorce. No mixing assets or anything like that. I signed that thing sitting in Frank's lawyer's office, feeling like the smallest person in the world, while he and Carol looked at me with that expression of, "We knew you were going to accept." We got married in the summer of 2012 at a huge wedding that her parents paid for, because clearly I couldn't afford something like that. And honestly, the first few years were good, I guess. We lived in a modest apartment in Denver. She kept teaching, and I liked my job, though I was making just enough. But I had ambition. You know, I didn't want to stay stuck making 40 or 50 grand for the rest of my life. I started working on freelance projects at night, helping small businesses with their IT systems, basically killing myself, working like 60 hours a week because I wanted more. I wanted to prove to Kimberly's parents that I wasn't the loser they thought I was. In 2015, something happened that changed everything. In a startup I'd done some freelance work for, offered me a full-time position with a decent salary, but more importantly, with stock options. I'm not gonna lie, At that time, I didn't fully understand how stock options worked, but I accepted because it seemed like a good opportunity. Kimberly wasn't very convinced because it meant working even more hours, and the base salary wasn't much better than what I was already making. But I had a feeling. I literally can't explain it better than that. I just felt it was the right thing to do. I worked at that startup for almost 3 years, and in 2018, we got acquired by a much bigger company. My stock options became real, and suddenly I don't know how to say this without sounding cocky, but I had a lot of money. Like almost $2 million after taxes, an amount I never in my life thought I'd see. I remember perfectly the day I got the deposit. I was in my office looking at my computer screen thinking, this can't be real. It has to be a mistake. I called Kimberly crying, literally crying like a kid, and she started crying too because it meant we could buy a house, I wouldn't have to worry about money, that we could really live comfortably. I quit my IT job like a month later and started my own property management company. I bought some rental properties using part of the money from the acquisition, hired a couple people to help me, and things took off faster than I expected. In less than 2 years, I already had like 50 properties under management and was making, 600,000 a year easy, probably more. We moved to a house in a nice neighborhood in Denver, not as fancy as Kimberly's parents' place, but definitely in that houses I never thought I could afford category. I bought a new Audi. Kimberly got herself a BMW. We traveled. Honestly, life was good, or at least I thought it was. This is where the story gets interesting, or rather, where it started becoming a nightmare without me realizing it. Frank and Carol suddenly became super friendly with me. Like, we went from seeing each other once every 2 months at awkward dinners to them calling me every week to grab coffee or catch up. Frank started asking me for investment advice, as if suddenly my opinion mattered when before he treated me like I couldn't even add. Carol asked me about properties, if I knew any good investment opportunities, if I could help them manage some properties they were thinking of buying. And I, like the idiot I was, felt flattered. After years of them making me feel inferior, they were finally treating me as an equal, or so I thought. What I didn't see coming, and I really should have seen it because it was obvious, was what happened next. This was like late 2022, almost 10 years after I'd signed that prenup. We were at Kimberly's parents' house for Thanksgiving. The whole family was there, including Heather, Kimberly's younger sister who'd always been cool with me. That detail is going to be important later, you'll see. We were drinking wine after dinner and Frank suddenly says, Nathan, Carol and I have been thinking about something and we'd like to discuss it with you. I immediately got alert because when Frank wanted to discuss something, it generally meant he wanted something from me. He tells me, look, that prenuptial agreement you signed years ago doesn't make sense anymore. Circumstances have changed completely. Now you and Kimberly have similar assets. Basically, there's no reason to keep that document. And I sat there thinking, okay, this is weird. Why do they suddenly care about the prenup? Carol added something like, it's just that we feel bad that we insisted on that when it clearly wasn't necessary. We want you to know we trust you completely. Well, my gut was telling me something didn't add up, but since I didn't want to ruin dinner, I told him I'd think about it and changed the subject. But they didn't leave it there, not at all. Over the following weeks, they started pressing harder. Frank would call me to talk about investments and always end the conversation with something like, oh, by the way, did you think about the prenup thing? Carol would invite Kimberly and me to dinner and bring up the topic casually in the middle of the meal. And the worst part is Kimberly started joining in the pressure. One night we were at home watching Netflix, and out of nowhere she says to me, why don't you want to dissolve the prenup? Don't you trust me? And I explained that it wasn't about trust, but that I didn't see the need to change something that was already established, that if the marriage was going well, that paper was irrelevant anyway. But she insisted, told me it made her feel like I was planning to divorce her, that it was important to her and her family. The arguments about this became more frequent and more intense. It was no longer just a casual comment, it was like a coordinated campaign where each member of her family pressured me from different angles. Frank would call me to tell me it was the right thing financially, Carol told me it was, the right thing emotionally, and Kimberly told me that if I really loved her, I would do it without questioning it. In February 2023, things reached a breaking point. One Saturday afternoon, I was in my home office, reviewing some contracts, when I hear several cars arrive. I go out and see it's Kimberly's entire family. Frank, Carol, Heather, even an uncle I almost never saw. Kimberly had invited them without telling me anything and basically organized an intervention in my own house. They all sat in my living room, and Frank took the floor like he was running a business meeting. He told us they'd come because this was already ridiculous, that I was being stubborn for no reason, that I was hurting Kimberly with my refusal, and that I needed to sign the papers to dissolve the prenup right then and there. Carol had the documents there, already prepared by their lawyer. They just needed my signature. I felt ambushed, betrayed, like I was in a courtroom being judged for a crime I didn't commit. I told them this was unacceptable, that I wasn't going to make a decision like that under pressure, and that I needed everyone to leave my house immediately. That's when everything exploded. Frank turned red with rage, yelling at me that I was ungrateful, that his family had accepted me when I was nobody. Carol was crying, saying I was destroying her daughter, and Kimberly was screaming at me that if I didn't sign, she was going to assume our marriage was over. The only person who wasn't participating in the drama was Heather, who looked super uncomfortable on the couch looking at her phone. So I kicked them all out of my house. Told Kimberly I needed space and went to a hotel that night because I couldn't even look at her face. I stayed at that hotel for like 3 days, not answering calls, just thinking about everything that had happened. Kimberly sent me messages saying I was overreacting, that her family only wanted what was best for us, that I was being irrational. But something wouldn't let me rest easy. That little voice in my head telling me there was something more. That nobody pushes that hard for something like this unless there's a hidden reason. On the 4th day, I got a message from Heather that said, "I need to talk to you. It's important. Please call me." I hesitated for a moment because I thought maybe it was part of the family strategy, but something in the tone of the message made me call her. What Heather told me on that call literally destroyed me and saved me at the same time. She said, "Look, Nathan, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I can't keep quiet anymore because what they're doing is wrong. Kimberly is cheating on you. She's had a lover for like 8 months, and my parents know. That's why they want you to dissolve the prenup, because Kimberly is going to ask you for a divorce soon, and they want to make sure you don't walk away empty-handed. They want her to be able to keep half of everything you have." I stayed silent for what seemed like forever, processing the words, feeling like the floor was opening up beneath me. I asked her how she knew that, and she said she'd overheard conversations between Kimberly and her mom, that she'd seen messages on Kimberly's phone by accident, and that she'd been feeling horrible for weeks keeping that secret. I hung up the phone and sat on that hotel bed staring at the wall, with my mind completely blank. After a while, I started mentally reviewing the last few months, looking for signs I'd ignored. Kimberly, coming home late more frequently, saying she'd had parent-teacher conferences or school events. The fact that we hardly had sex anymore, when before our intimate life was good. The times I'd caught her smiling, looking at her phone and quickly putting it away when she saw me. Everything fit together, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been refusing to see. I went back home the next day, determined to confront her, but not directly. I needed proof. I needed concrete evidence before accusing her because I knew she'd deny everything. I hired a private investigator. Yeah, like in the movies, turns out that's real, and gave him access to our shared bank accounts to review transactions. In less than a week, he brought me a report that included photos of Kimberly going into a hotel with a guy I later found out was a parent of one of her students. A divorced guy, like 45, who worked in finance. The investigator also found charges on our credit card for expensive restaurant dinners. On days she told me she was staying late at work, hotel reservations in Denver paid with her personal card. Basically all the evidence I needed. When I finally confronted her, it was a Friday evening. She got home around 7, probably coming from seeing him, and I was sitting in the living room with the investigator's report on the coffee table. I said, "Kimberly, we need to talk," and she immediately got defensive, asking about what, with that tone you use when you know you got caught, but still, I won't admit anything. I pushed the folder toward her and said, "Read it." I watched her face go through a series of expressions as she flipped through the pages: denial, shock, fear, and finally resignation. She tried to explain herself, told me it had been a mistake, that she was confused, that the guy didn't mean anything, all the classic excuses you hear in these situations. I asked her if her parents knew, and she stayed quiet, which was basically a confession. I told her I wanted a divorce, and that thanks to that prenup, they'd wanted to eliminate so badly, she wasn't going to get a single penny of my money. Plus, since we had a marriage in a state that considers infidelity as grounds for divorce with legal consequences, and I had documented evidence of her adultery, she basically had no leverage. I watched her fall apart in front of my eyes, crying, begging me to reconsider, saying we could go to couples therapy. But I was already done. Emotionally and mentally, I'd closed that chapter the moment I saw the photos. I gave her two options. She left the house that night or I left, and the next day I'd start the legal process. She packed some things and went to her parents' house. I hired the best divorce attorney I could find and gave him all the evidence. The process was relatively quick, because with the prenup and proof of infidelity, there wasn't much to discuss. Kimberly and her parents tried to fight, obviously. Her lawyer argued the prenup had been signed under duress, which was ironic considering they were the ones who insisted on it. But they couldn't prove anything. Within 6 months, the divorce was finalized. Kimberly received nothing except what she'd brought into the marriage and what she'd earned with her teacher's salary, which honestly wasn't much because everything she earned, she spent. The house, my properties, my business, everything stayed with me just as the prenup established. But wait, because this is where the story gets even better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it. Turns out the guy Kimberly was having the affair with had thought she was rich, or that she was going to be after the divorce. When he found out she came out of the marriage with nothing, he literally left her. He cut her off completely, blocked her number and everything. Kimberly tried to come back to me like 3 months after the divorce. She showed up at my office one day. My assistant tried to stop her, but she pushed through, crying, saying she'd made the worst mistake of her life, that she loved me, that it had all been a confusion. I told her to call security and have her escorted out of the building. There was no going back. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the betrayal, not just from her, but from her entire family. And speaking of her family, Frank and Carol are also going through serious financial problems now. Turns out a lot of their successful investments from recent years depended on my advice, and without that, they've made several bad decisions that cost them quite a bit of money. Frank's dealerships are struggling because the auto industry has changed a lot and he didn't adapt, and Carol's boutique closed last year because it was basically an expensive hobby that only worked when they had money to spare to maintain it. I'm not going to lie and say I don't feel a certain satisfaction knowing they're suffering the consequences of their greed. But I don't actively gloat about it either. I just moved on with my life. The only person from that family I still occasionally talk to is Heather. She apologized to me multiple times for not telling me about the cheating sooner, and although it took her time to decide to speak up, the fact that she eventually did means something. She's distanced from her parents now because she doesn't agree with how they handled everything, and every now and then we grab coffee to catch up. She's good people. Honestly, the only member of that family who had any conscience. As for me, I'm doing well now. My company keeps growing. I already have over 100 properties under management, and I'm expanding to other cities in Colorado. I've been seeing someone new for a few months. Nothing serious yet, but it's nice to have company without all the drama and manipulation. I've thought a lot about everything that happened, and honestly, I think the universe, or whatever, has strange ways of balancing things out. If I'd given in and dissolved that prenup, I'd be in a horrible legal battle now, and probably would have lost millions. That document they made me sign years ago, like it was garbage, ended up being the only thing that protected me from being completely destroyed. The biggest lesson I took from all this, I guess, is that you need to trust your instincts. When something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And people who really love you don't pressure you or manipulate you to do things that go against your interests. Kimberly and her family never saw me as real family. I was always the outsider who managed to sneak in, and when I had something they wanted, they tried to take everything they could, but I stood firm in my decision, and that literally saved me. So yeah, I'm good now. Better than good, actually. And they're exactly where they deserve to be.